Do UFOs represent some sort of threat, or is this just government propaganda? The topic of UFOs and extraterrestrials, as well as the possible extra-dimensional origins of these supposed intelligences and craft, continues to gain rapid popularity and credible disclosure within the mainstream, and that's just because of the fact that the UFO phenomenon is indeed real. These objects are spotted, photographed, recorded on video, commonly tracked on radar, and observed by military pilots who are scrambled to take a closer look. This is evidence that cannot be denied, which is why Christopher Mellon, who served 30 years in the federal government and was Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Intelligence from 1997 to 2002, published articles, detailed articles for outlets like The Hill as well as The Washington Post, emphasizing the reality and seriousness of this subject. He's one of several to do so. Don't get me wrong, it's just great to see this type of UFO mainstream disclosure taking place, although it's unfortunate that the topic, or any topic for that matter, has to be taken seriously by mainstream media for many to even take the subject seriously. This type of disclosure is well overdue given the fact that there has been a long campaign of official secrecy and ridicule, as stated by Roscoe Hillenkotter, the very first director of the CIA. But why now? The topic of UFOs has been gaining a tremendous amount of popularity and credibility, not only from the type of sources listed above, but also from a slew of credible whistleblowers from the intelligence agencies, the agents, ex-government officials, high-ranking military personnel, astronauts, and many more who have been and are disclosing this reality. There was and has been more than ample evidence to show that UFOs are real, that they are objects in our atmosphere which are technically miles in advance of anything we can deploy. So again, why now? This is what the Lord Admiral Hill Norton, former chairman of NATO Military Committee, said. So why now? It seems that mainstream media had no choice but to jump on the topic and attempt to control it. And like I said, mainstream coverage of the topic of UFOs is great, but one cannot help but point out the fact that mainstream media outlets, or as I like to refer to them, established mouthpieces, have been feeding us disinformation and misinformation since that inception. Does this mean they plan to do the same thing with UFOs? Operation Mockingbird is a great example, but it seems like it's still going on today. Dr. Udo Ulfkotte, who was a top German journalist and editor and has been for more than 2 decades, went on the record stating that he was forced to publish the works of intelligence agents under his own name, also mentioning that non-compliance would result in him losing his job. William Arkin, a longtime well-known military and war reporter who's best known for his groundbreaking 3-part Washington Post series on the Black Budget in 2010, has gone public about NBC, MSNBC as completely fake government-run agencies. You can read more about that here in the link below. There are even declassified documents that clearly show the relationship that intelligence agencies like the CIA have with mainstream media as well as academia. This is important to note. Why is this important to recognize? It's simple because, again, we've all seen this deception, at least for the most part, which is why it raises an eyebrow how people with backgrounds like Mellon all of a sudden are able to publish serious pieces in these media outlets about the topics of UFOs. What about all of the other activists and researchers and whistleblowers over the years? Why are they not receiving any attention at all? Was the UFO topic becoming so popular that the powers that be are now simply trying to control the narrative of the subject? And if so, what are they trying to do with this? This is just speculation on my part, and I'm sure on the part of many other researchers out there. The narrative, the threat narrative. One thing that seems to rub me the wrong way about mainstream UFO disclosure is what seems to be a constant threat narrative. This is a phenomenon that dates back hundreds, if not thousands of years. Cases have been documented for a very, very long time. If there was some sort of extraterrestrial threat or a threat to national security by these objects, if they are extraterrestrial in origin, would not some type of event have already taken place by now? Why is it that a threat narrative always seems to accompany any type of UFO disclosure to be by the mainstream? Perhaps the elite want to weaponize space, or perhaps they want to present it as a threat the same way they present some other things such as terrorism as a threat to justify immoral actions. These are all important points to consider given the fact that we've already been lied to and misled on so many other major topics. So why should the topic of UFOs be any different? That being said, perhaps there is no threat type of agenda here. More on that in a bit. But this phenomenon is deep, and to anybody who is researching it knows that it's not fair to a number of researchers and experts who have been left out of this process of mainstream disclosure. Mainstream disclosure does not address all of the information and evidence that's piled up over the years. It's simply government or perhaps deep state disclosure. The narrative is controlled, and despite the vastness of the subject, we're simply getting a narrowed down view of the phenomenon. Whether the intentions of mainstream UFO disclosures are good or bad remains to be seen. Now, I'm not saying that malevolent forces from other worlds don't exist, and I'm not saying that benevolent forces don't either. Based on all of my research over the past decade, there are no doubt some disturbing aspects that are associated with this phenomenon. The phenomenon itself, whether benevolent or malevolent, is in itself a disturbing paradigm buster for many people. There are also opposite and uplifting factors that go hand in hand with the phenomenon as well. As we as a collective are not yet ready for mass disclosure and all of its implications, if we were, it would have happened already. Perhaps it's happening slowly at a pace that best suits human consciousness. Perhaps the deep state or people in power are not controlling disclosure. Perhaps we are, perhaps they are, perhaps it means on their terms when we are ready and not ours. Some malevolent aspects of this phenomenon may even be connected to our own government, like abductions, for example. There are reasons to believe that a large majority of forced abduction experiments are actually run by psychological warfare experiments. In his book Forbidden Science 4, Dr. Jacques Vallée explains how he came in possession of documents showing that forced UFO abductions were conducted by CIA as psychological warfare experiments, and you can read about them in the link here. A former member of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Richard Doughty, also claimed the same thing, that he was one of the many who were tasked with spreading disinformation into the field. You can read more about that here. Government agencies have long infiltrated the field for a sole purpose of spreading disinformation in order to drive researchers and investigators far away from the truth. This is something that is still happening at large today, in my opinion. Is mainstream UFO disclosure part of this information campaign? So far, it doesn't look like it, as they've done a good job bringing legitimacy to the reality of the phenomenon. But we have yet to see how far they go. With regards to the mainstream UFO disclosure, Mellon and the organization he's part of, Tom DeLonge's TTSA, are doing a great job of bringing awareness to real phenomenon. However, again, the term threat seems to be used constantly, especially by a former Pentagon official that's part of the team, Luis Elizondo. Elizondo is part of the now disclosed aerial threat program at the Pentagon, one that tracked and kept a close watch on UFOs that entered into our atmosphere. The New York Times broke the story about a secret Pentagon program, but any UFO researcher knows these programs are more in-depth, expensive, and expansive than anything that's described in that article. Elizondo emphasized on multiple occasions that he believes these objects are indeed extraterrestrial in origin. In the clip linked in the sentence, he also mentions a potential threat multiple times. The threat narrative is understandable, but this is not to say that perceiving these objects as a potential threat is not justified, but for years these objects have performed evasive maneuvers. The fact is, from a military point of view, it's understandable why these are perceived as a threat. It's not illogical, after all. These objects are technologically more advanced than any aircraft known to man. If somehow something is violating airspace and hovering over nuclear missile facilities, for example, which they often do, it would be irresponsible for our military not to at least consider a possible threat, or at least at our current level of human consciousness. The evasive characteristics and efforts to avoid our own aircraft has been emphasized by multiple people, like Canadian Defence Minister Paul Hellyer, for example, who said that these objects commonly take corrective measures to avoid our aircraft, quote unquote, and that our military tends to, quote, shoot first and ask questions after, end quote. Don't forget 4-star General Nathan Twining, who stated in a declassified intelligence document decades ago that, quote, the phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious. The reported operating characteristics such as extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, particularly in roll, and motion, which must be considered evasive when sighted or contacted by friendly aircraft and radar, lend belief to the possibility that some of the objects are controlled either manually, automatically, or remotely, end quote. And you can link on the link is in the source. The source link is here in the link. There are a trove of declassified document cases that also show the same thing. So we must ask ourselves, are these objects genuine threats? Have they shown themselves to be threats? Has their behavior been indicative of any type of threat activity? There are some cases you could maybe argue that yes, their behavior has been aggressive, but for most part, based on my research, there isn't really much to base a threat narrative off of when it comes to the examination of how these objects have been observed and recorded. There are literally practically zero cases that represent that type of behavior. The way mainstream UFO disclosure stands now, it's not an extreme over the top threat type of narrative as of yet, but it's there, no doubt, and it seems to be the only perspective that's being pushed without considering other possibilities. Is this being done for ulterior motives, or is it innocent? I don't know. Again, unidentified flying objects entering into our airspace, hovering over nuclear bases, tampering with nuclear weapons, etc. From our level of perception, it's easy to see how this type of activity is perceived as a threat, but is there a fear-mongering agenda here? Or is this perception simply necessary, at least from our current level of consciousness? Is there an agenda here? Or is this just a natural, expected narrative? I'll let you decide. There have been suggestions for people with interesting backgrounds that a threat narrative is being used for a supposed false flag alien invasion, but I'm not going to go into that. And you can read more about that here in the link. The classified black budget world would have to be really advanced to pull that off. Perhaps they are. It's also important to mention that there is no easy way to disclose the reality of this phenomenon. Mainstream UFO disclosure can't simply burst out and hit the unawake Ned population with certain truths about this topic. It's disturbing in many ways as it's uplifting and encouraging. There are many dimensions and aspects to this phenomenon, and it opens up countless amounts of questions that veer off into many other related fields. It's a paradigm buster. At the end of the day, regardless of how they're perceived by our military and our elite authority agencies, the fact remains that a large majority of cases clearly show no hostility and are not indicative at all of any type of hostility. Sure, they may be intrusive, curious, strange, but again, the phenomenon seems to be older than we are, and we still have no clear signs of hostility as of yet. If anything, I'd imagine that our race is the one they have to be cautious of. So again, we have to ask ourselves, is the threat narrative being pushed? Are good people who believe we should be precautious and perceive them as a threat being used to push some sort of ulterior agenda? Or is this simply protocol to assume the threat narrative? The takeaway. I've said it before and I'll say it again, this topic truly leaves no aspect of humanity untouched. It has huge implications spiritually, technologically, historically, and scientifically. The process of disclosure is long, and it won't come from any type of authority figure. It will happen naturally, in my opinion, as time goes on, and as the collective mind opens up to the fact that we are not alone in the universe, and that we have been and are being visited for a very long time. Does UFO represent some sort of threat, or is this government propaganda originally created for collective evolution, published here under Creative Commons on Collective Spark by Steve McCamley? Please leave your comments. Tell us what you think. Thank you. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.